The fastest way to discover what someone really thinks about your property is to leave your garage door open long enough for them to treat it like their own. The rattle of my garage door echoed through the quiet Saturday morning just as the first rays of sunlight slipped across my driveway. I expected to see my father's old Mustang sitting beneath its gray cover, surrounded by neatly organized tool cabinets and the workbench where I spent nearly every weekend restoring pieces of American history one bolt at a time. Instead, the motor stopped, the door reached the ceiling, and my entire body froze. Cardboard boxes were stacked almost to the garage door tracks. Folding chairs leaned against my tool chest. Plastic storage bins filled with faded holiday decorations covered the workbench. Metal signposts, traffic cones, portable tables, old banners, and several dusty file cabinets occupied nearly every open space. The smell of old cardboard mixed with stale fabric and damp concrete instantly replaced the familiar scent of fresh-cut lumber and motor oil that had always made my garage feel like home. Sitting directly on top of the largest stack was a bright laminated sheet with bold black letters that read, "Temporary HOA Storage." Temporary. I actually laughed out loud because nothing about the scene looked temporary. My name is Ethan Brooks, and I have lived in Willow Creek for almost 7 years. I am a mechanical engineer by profession, but every free evening and nearly every weekend finds me inside that garage rebuilding classic cars, repairing old tools, or simply enjoying the quiet place my father helped me create before he passed away. Every cabinet had a purpose. Every drawer held carefully labeled parts. Every wrench returned to the same hook after each project. My garage was never just another place to park a vehicle. It was the one room in my house that still felt like a conversation with my father every time I walked inside. Seeing it buried beneath someone else's belongings felt less like an inconvenience and more like watching a stranger rearrange years of memories without asking permission. At first, I honestly wondered whether the Homeowners Association had made some unbelievable mistake. Maybe a delivery crew had gone to the wrong address. Maybe someone misunderstood an instruction. Then I noticed several boxes labeled with handwritten notes that included the name Linda Carson. That erased every doubt. Linda was the president of our Homeowners Association, and over the past year she had developed an impressive talent for treating neighborhood rules as though they applied to everyone except herself. I pulled out my phone and began taking photographs from the driveway before touching a single item. Every angle, every stack, every label, every inch of the garage floor that had disappeared beneath piles of things that clearly did not belong there. As I continued documenting the scene, I noticed fresh tire marks leading away from the garage entrance, confirming that someone had unloaded everything only hours earlier. The quiet neighborhood around me carried on as though nothing unusual had happened. Sprinklers clicked across nearby lawns, birds sang from the maple trees lining the street, and neighbors walked their dogs without realizing that behind my open garage door, someone had quietly decided my private property had become community storage space. What Linda did not realize was that this would become the last morning any of her belongings ever spent inside my garage. My father used to say that every garage tells the story of the person who owns it long before they ever speak a single word. Growing up, ours was never the cleanest building on the block, but somehow every tool, every shelf, and every project had its own place. Saturday mornings smelled like sawdust, fresh coffee, warm engine oil, and old leather gloves that had survived more repairs than I could count. While other kids spent weekends at the mall or on the baseball field, I stood beside my father handing him socket wrenches, polishing chrome trim, and learning that patience was usually more valuable than expensive equipment. When he passed away several years before I bought my house in Willow Creek, I promised myself that wherever I lived next, I would build a garage that honored everything he had taught me. It took nearly 4 years to finish it exactly the way I wanted. Every cabinet was measured and installed by hand. Every workbench was positioned so afternoon sunlight reached the surface without creating harsh shadows. The gray concrete floor stayed clean enough that friends joked it looked more like a showroom than a workshop. In the center sat my father's 1967 Mustang beneath a fitted cover, waiting for the weekends when I had enough time to continue restoring it piece by piece. That car was not valuable because of its market price. It mattered because every repaired panel reminded me of conversations I could still hear whenever I picked up a wrench. The garage became the one place where the noise of daily life disappeared. After long days working as a mechanical engineer, I could close the door, turn on the overhead lights, and lose myself rebuilding engines or restoring vintage tools while classic rock played softly from an old radio sitting above the workbench. Neighbors often stopped by just to admire the projects or ask for advice about fixing lawn equipment and older vehicles. I never minded helping because my father believed knowledge only became more valuable when it was shared. That was why opening the garage that Saturday morning felt so deeply unsettling. It was not simply that someone had filled the room with belongings that were not mine. Every unfamiliar box covered spaces connected to years of memories. The folding chairs leaned against the same cabinet where my father's toolbox had always rested. Plastic bins blocked the path I walked almost every evening after work. Holiday decorations sat where the Mustang usually received careful attention beneath bright shop lights. The entire room felt unfamiliar despite being inside my own home. I stood quietly for several minutes, listening to the distant sound of lawn mowers echo across the neighborhood, while dust floated through narrow beams of morning sunlight. The more I looked around, the more obvious it became that none of this had happened by accident. The boxes were arranged neatly, labels faced outward, and temporary shelving had even been assembled inside my garage. Whoever moved everything into the space clearly expected it to remain there for much longer than a few days. That realization settled over me with surprising calm. I was no longer trying to understand why it had happened. I was beginning to understand exactly how confident someone had become that I would simply accept it. By Monday afternoon, I had a pretty clear picture of how everything had ended up inside my garage, and the answer was almost more unbelievable than the boxes themselves. I called Linda Carson and politely explained that her belongings had been left inside my private property without my permission. There was a brief silence before she laughed as though I had asked the most unnecessary question in the world. She told me the Homeowners Association needed temporary space while the clubhouse storage room was being reorganized, and said my garage was the most convenient location because I kept it clean and had plenty of room. She spoke with complete confidence, never once asking whether I agreed or whether she should remove the items immediately. Instead, she thanked me for supporting the community and assured me everything would be gone in a week or two. Before I could respond, she ended the call. I stood in the middle of the crowded garage holding my phone, surrounded by someone else's property, wondering how a conversation about permission had somehow turned into an announcement about my new responsibility. I decided to remain calm and sent a polite email documenting the conversation. I clearly explained that the garage was private property, that I had never agreed to store Homeowners Association materials, and that I expected everything to be removed as soon as possible. The next morning, I received a short reply from Linda thanking me again for my cooperation. That single sentence told me she had either ignored everything I wrote or simply believed my opinion no longer mattered. Days turned into another week, and instead of seeing fewer boxes, I noticed more arriving. Every evening after work, I found another stack of folding tables, another container filled with seasonal decorations, another bundle of event signs, or another plastic storage bin sitting where my tools had once been. My workbench slowly disappeared behind towers of cardboard. The pathway leading to the Mustang became so narrow that I had to turn sideways just to reach the driver's door. One evening, I discovered that someone had even taped handwritten inventory numbers onto my storage cabinets, as though the garage had officially become part of the association's warehouse. That was the moment I realized this had stopped being a temporary inconvenience. It had quietly become standard operating procedure. Curious whether anyone else knew about it, I mentioned the situation to two neighbors while collecting my mail. One looked genuinely surprised, but quickly shrugged and said Linda probably had a good reason. The other smiled awkwardly and suggested I should be proud that the association trusted me enough to use my space. Neither person asked the obvious question of why nobody had ever requested permission from the homeowner. Their reactions explained far more than their words. Somewhere along the way, Linda's confidence had convinced people that convenience outweighed ownership whenever she declared it necessary. Walking back toward my house that evening, I glanced through the open garage door at the growing maze of boxes illuminated by the warm glow of the overhead lights. My father's Mustang remained hidden beneath its protective cover, nearly invisible behind stacks of belongings that had absolutely nothing to do with me. For the first time since this began, I stopped wondering how long the situation would last. Instead, I began paying close attention to every new box that appeared, because something told me those details would matter much more than anyone realized. The following Thursday, I attended my first homeowners association meeting in nearly a year, not because I expected a miracle, but because I wanted to hear the explanation directly instead of relying on rumors. The clubhouse smelled faintly of fresh coffee and floor polish, while folding chairs filled the meeting room in neat rows. Ironically, I immediately recognized several of those chairs because they had been sitting inside my garage only the night before. I took a seat near the back without saying much and listened as routine discussions about landscaping contracts, pool maintenance, and holiday decorations filled the first half of the evening. Finally, during the homeowner comment period, I stood up and calmly explained that association property had been placed inside my private garage without my authorization and that repeated requests to remove it had been ignored. The room became noticeably quieter. Several neighbors turned toward Linda Carson, expecting an explanation. She smiled with remarkable confidence and thanked me publicly for supporting the community before adding that every successful neighborhood depended on residents willing to cooperate during temporary inconveniences. She never denied that the items were inside my garage. Instead, she presented the situation as though I had volunteered the space from the very beginning. Before I could respond, one board member commented that everyone occasionally needed to make small sacrifices for the benefit of the neighborhood. Another suggested the storage issue would probably resolve itself once the clubhouse renovations were finished. I looked around the room and realized that almost nobody asked the obvious question. Had the homeowner ever agreed to any of this? The discussion moved on within minutes, leaving my concern buried beneath budget reports and committee announcements. Walking back to my truck afterward, I felt strangely calm instead of frustrated. Their response had answered something I had been wondering ever since I opened the garage door that Saturday morning. This was never simply about boxes. It was about assumptions. Somewhere along the way, Linda had become so comfortable making decisions for other people that permission had quietly been replaced by expectation. The next morning, another surprise waited for me. A new stack of long plastic storage containers had appeared beside my workbench, along with several framed community event signs wrapped in protective blankets. Attached to one container was a printed inventory sheet listing my garage by street address as an official storage location. Seeing my own home identified that way almost made me laugh because it was so absurd. Instead of reacting emotionally, I picked up my phone and photographed every label, every inventory sheet, every new delivery, and every corner of the garage from multiple angles. I saved copies of every email, every text message, and every voicemail connected to the situation, organizing everything into dated folders on my computer. As the collection grew, something inside me shifted. I stopped hoping Linda would suddenly change her mind because her actions had already established a clear pattern. From that point forward, I was no longer collecting memories of an inconvenience. I was quietly documenting a complete timeline, and although nobody else realized it yet, every additional box carried into my garage was strengthening the story the evidence would eventually tell. By the beginning of the third week, I had completely stopped asking anyone to remove the boxes. That decision surprised even me because I usually believed most problems could be solved with a respectful conversation. This one had already proven otherwise. Every polite email had been answered with another assumption. Every calm request had somehow become another excuse to leave the belongings exactly where they were. So instead of arguing, I started paying attention. Every evening after work, I backed my truck into the driveway, walked into the garage, and quietly documented every change before I even took off my jacket. I noted the date, the time, the number of new containers, and every label attached to them. I photographed fresh tire tracks whenever another delivery appeared. I recorded which items blocked access to my workbench and how much space remained around my father's Mustang. I even measured the shrinking walkway with a tape measure because I wanted facts instead of opinions. The process became almost routine. While other people saw clutter, I saw evidence building one piece at a time. One evening, I decided to read every page of our homeowners association governing documents instead of relying on what board members claimed during meetings. It took several hours, a yellow highlighter, and more coffee than I probably should have consumed, but eventually I found exactly what I was looking for. There were detailed sections explaining common areas, association property, maintenance responsibilities, and homeowner obligations. There were pages describing storage rules for the clubhouse and equipment. What I did not find anywhere was language allowing the association to occupy private residential garages without written permission from the homeowner. I read the section 3 different times just to make sure I had not overlooked something. The silence inside the garage felt almost comforting as the realization settled in. Linda had spoken with absolute confidence because she expected nobody to verify what she claimed. The next morning, I contacted the County Property Records Office and requested copies of the documents describing my lot boundaries and ownership rights. Everything confirmed what I already knew. My garage was part of my private property and not designated for community use under any circumstance. I organized the paperwork inside a binder alongside printed emails, photographs, meeting notes, and copies of every message I had exchanged with Linda. Looking through the growing stack, I realized the story had changed. At first, it looked like a disagreement over storage space. Now it looked like a documented pattern of unauthorized use that had continued despite repeated written objections. The more organized everything became, the calmer I felt. I no longer needed to convince anyone with emotion because facts were beginning to speak much louder than frustration ever could. Meanwhile, another delivery arrived before sunset. 2 volunteers unloaded additional plastic bins while chatting casually at the end of my driveway, smiling and waving as though they were helping with a neighborhood project I had happily approved. I smiled back, said nothing, and watched them leave. As soon as their truck disappeared around the corner, I picked up my camera, added another page to the binder, and quietly realized that Linda was still making the same mistake. She believed my silence meant surrender, when in reality it meant I had finally started preparing instead of protesting. The plan finally came together on a quiet Tuesday evening while I was sitting alone at the corner of my crowded workbench with my binder open beside me. Outside, the last light of the day stretched across the driveway, casting long shadows through the open garage door. Inside, every cardboard box, folding chair, and plastic storage bin seemed to remind me that someone else had been making decisions about my property for nearly a month. I flipped through the photographs one more time. The first image showed my spotless garage exactly as it had looked before everything changed. The last photograph, taken only hours earlier, barely showed the concrete floor beneath the stacks of association supplies. Between those 2 pictures was a complete timeline that could not be argued away. Every date matched an email. Every delivery matched a photograph. Every request for removal had been answered with another excuse or another assumption. That was when I realized I no longer needed anyone's permission to solve the problem. I simply needed to follow the rules more carefully than the people who had ignored them. I spent the next several hours researching my county's procedures for handling property left on private premises without authorization. The information was surprisingly straightforward. There were specific notification requirements, reasonable deadlines, and documented steps that protected both the property owner and the original owner of the belongings. I printed every relevant guideline and compared each requirement against my growing file of evidence. Nothing would be rushed. Nothing would rely on emotion. Every step would be documented, transparent, and completely consistent with local procedures. The following morning, I prepared a formal written notice addressed to Linda Carson and copied the Homeowners Association board. The letter listed the items occupying my garage, included photographs, referenced my previous emails, and clearly explained that the belongings needed to be removed within the legally appropriate time frame. I also explained what the next step would be if they remained after the deadline expired, citing the applicable county guidance instead of making personal demands. I mailed certified copies, sent digital copies by electronic mail, and kept proof of every delivery confirmation inside the binder. Then I waited. For the first time since this situation began, I felt no urgency at all. Every evening I walked into the garage, took a fresh set of photographs, updated my notes, and closed the binder again. The silence became strangely peaceful because I knew exactly what came next regardless of whether anyone responded. Days passed without a single truck arriving to collect the boxes. Linda did not call. She did not send another email thanking me for my cooperation. She simply acted as though the notice did not exist. Even more surprising, another volunteer quietly dropped off 2 additional storage containers near the back wall, apparently unaware that a formal deadline was already counting down. I photographed those as well before carefully adding the new images to the growing stack of evidence. Standing there beside my father's covered Mustang, I looked across the crowded garage and realized that the balance of the entire situation had quietly shifted. Linda still believed she controlled the story because all she could see were boxes. I was looking at dates, documents, and decisions, and before long those would matter far more than anything taking up space inside my garage. The deadline expired on a Friday afternoon without a single response from Linda or anyone on the Homeowners Association board. My certified mail receipts confirmed the notices had been delivered. My electronic mail records showed they had been opened. The photographs proved nothing had been removed. I stood in the garage for several minutes after work, listening to the quiet hum of the overhead lights while looking at the same rows of boxes that had been sitting there for weeks. The difference now was not what filled the room. The difference was that every required step had been completed exactly as the county guidelines described. I called the county office one final time to verify I had overlooked nothing. The employee reviewed the timeline, confirmed the notification requirements had been satisfied, and explained the remaining options available under the local procedures. Hearing that quiet confirmation felt strangely satisfying because it removed every remaining doubt. This was no longer a disagreement between neighbors. It had become a matter of following established rules. Early the next morning, I completed the final paperwork and arranged for the unattended property to be handled through the appropriate local process after the legally required notice period had ended. Everything was documented. Every item was photographed before it left the garage. Detailed inventories were attached to the file. Nothing disappeared in secret, and nothing happened without records showing exactly where the property had gone and how the owners could recover it if permitted under the applicable procedures. By late afternoon, the transformation was almost impossible to believe. For the first time in more than a month, I could actually see the smooth, gray concrete floor stretching from the garage door to the back wall. Sunlight reflected across the polished surface exactly the way it had before this entire situation began. I rolled my father's Mustang forward a few feet, uncovered the hood, and simply stood there smiling as the familiar scent of clean metal, rubber, and motor oil slowly replaced the stale odor of old cardboard that had lingered for weeks. The garage finally sounded like itself again. The echo of my footsteps had returned because there was open space instead of stacks of storage bins absorbing every sound. I had barely finished reorganizing my tool chest when my phone rang. Linda's name appeared across the screen. I answered calmly. Her voice carried none of the confidence I had heard during our earlier conversations. She demanded to know where the Homeowners Association property had gone and insisted that I had no authority to remove it. I quietly explained that I had done exactly what the written notices described after the deadline passed, and that every action had followed the applicable county procedures. I also reminded her that copies of those notices had been sent to both her and the board weeks earlier. There was a long silence before she asked where the belongings could now be located. I provided the appropriate contact information along with the reference numbers from the documented process. She ended the call without another word. I set the phone back on the workbench, looked around the garage that my father and I had once dreamed of building together, and realized something important. Linda had spent weeks assuming ownership could be replaced by confidence. In a single afternoon, confidence had run out, but the paperwork was still standing exactly where I had left it. The following Homeowners Association meeting felt completely different before it even began. Conversations that normally revolved around landscaping or neighborhood events had shifted into quiet whispers the moment people walked through the clubhouse doors. I recognized several neighbors who had politely avoided eye contact with me only a few weeks earlier. This time they nodded, smiled, and asked how I was doing. A few even admitted they had heard pieces of what happened but wanted to understand the full story. I simply told them everything had been handled according to the law and left it at that. I had no interest in embarrassing anyone because the documents already spoke for themselves. When the meeting officially started, Linda looked noticeably different from the confident person who had once thanked me for my supposed cooperation in front of the entire room. She shuffled papers several times before speaking, avoided looking directly toward my side of the room, and stumbled through the opening agenda with an uncertainty I had never seen before. Halfway through the meeting, another board member unexpectedly requested time to discuss concerns about association procedures involving private property. The room became completely silent. Copies of several emails, meeting notes, and correspondence were distributed to every board member. None of those documents contained opinions or accusations. They simply presented dates, photographs, written objections, certified mail confirmations, and the timeline showing that association property had remained inside my garage despite repeated requests for removal. One board member quietly asked Linda whether written permission had ever been obtained before using my garage. She admitted that no signed authorization existed because she believed it would only be temporary. Another member asked why additional items continued to be delivered after I had already requested that everything be removed. She had no clear answer. Someone else pointed out that my formal notice had been received weeks before the deadline expired. Again, there was only silence. Watching the discussion unfold was almost surreal because nobody needed dramatic speeches. Every question was answered by paperwork that had already been organized weeks earlier. The confidence that had once carried every decision seemed to disappear with each document placed on the conference table. By the end of the discussion, the board voted to begin reviewing its storage policies, require written homeowner authorization for any future requests involving private property, and conduct an internal review of how the situation had been handled. Linda remained seated without saying much while the remaining agenda continued around her. As neighbors slowly left the clubhouse that evening, several people stopped to apologize for assuming the association had acted appropriately simply because nobody questioned it at the beginning. One retired couple admitted they had almost volunteered part of their own garage before realizing they had never actually been asked either. Driving home beneath the warm glow of the neighborhood streetlights, I realized something that had not been obvious when this whole situation started. People had never intentionally supported unfair behavior. Most had simply trusted confidence more than facts. Once the facts finally appeared in the proper order, the story changed on its own. My garage had become empty days earlier, but that evening something else had quietly been cleared away as well. The assumption that authority could replace permission had finally disappeared, and it was not because anyone shouted louder. It was because the truth had been documented carefully enough that nobody could reasonably ignore it anymore. Several months have passed since that meeting, and every Saturday morning still begins the same way. The garage door rolls upward with its familiar mechanical hum. Sunlight stretches across the clean concrete floor, and the first thing I see is my father's 1967 Mustang, waiting exactly where it belongs. The scent of fresh-cut wood, machine oil, and coffee has returned, replacing the stale smell of cardboard that once filled every corner of the room. Sometimes I catch myself smiling before I even realize it because the space finally feels like home again. I finished restoring the front suspension on the Mustang a few weeks after everything was resolved, and the first drive through the neighborhood felt less like a victory lap and more like a quiet reminder that some things are worth protecting no matter how small they seem to other people. The Homeowners Association changed more than I expected. New written policies now require documented homeowner approval before any private property can ever be used for association business. Storage procedures were rewritten, board decisions became more transparent, and meeting minutes began including far more detail than they ever had before. Those changes did not happen because of one dramatic confrontation. They happened because ordinary records, careful documentation, and patience made it impossible for anyone to pretend the problem had never existed. Linda eventually stepped down as president several weeks later. I never celebrated her departure because that had never been my goal. Replacing one person means very little if the system never learns from its mistakes. What mattered was seeing neighbors become more comfortable asking respectful questions whenever new policies were introduced, instead of assuming every decision automatically deserved unquestioned acceptance. A few people even stopped by my garage over the following months to apologize for dismissing my concerns in the beginning. I accepted every apology because I understood how easily confidence can be mistaken for authority when nobody slows down long enough to examine the facts. One afternoon, the retired couple from my street visited while I was polishing the Mustang. They laughed as they admitted they had started reading every homeowners association notice much more carefully than before. We spent the next hour talking about old cars instead of neighborhood politics, and that conversation reminded me of something my father always believed. Good neighbors are built through mutual respect, not unquestioned obedience. Before leaving, they noticed a small wooden sign hanging above my workbench. I had carved it myself from a piece of oak left over from one of my father's projects. The words were simple: "Private property deserves private respect." It was never meant as a warning. It was a reminder for me as much as anyone else. Looking back now, the most valuable thing I gained was not an empty garage. It was the confidence that calm persistence can accomplish what anger rarely can. I never needed to shout. I never needed revenge. I only needed to understand the rules, document the truth, and trust that facts would eventually outweigh assumptions. Every time I close the garage door at the end of another quiet Saturday, I think about how easily this story could have ended with frustration if I had allowed emotion to make the decisions. Instead, it ended with my home restored, my father's workshop exactly as he would have wanted it, in a neighborhood that finally remembered something simple but important. Real justice is rarely loud. It is careful, patient, and almost always arrives carrying a folder full of evidence.